The joke about that is actually that the first time I heard Dean Martijn, I didn't even know, because I'm Dutch, why that was even funny. So I'm a professor of finance. I did my PhD here right in the city. I spent 10 years at Yale, now 7 years at Notre Dame. I'm going to talk as a finance professor, but perhaps an unusual finance professor, because the main class I've been teaching at Notre Dame, and I still continue to teach while I serve as dean, is a class that looks at Catholic social thought and tries to integrate it with finance. So that's also what I will try to do in my talk today. Okay. So I'm going to start by giving you a very brief, broad outline of my Catholic vision for business, using an analogy and a print piece of art. In that context, I'm going to talk about what I think of as the main challenge for finance. And that is how to, in a very competitive environment, as we have, certainly on Wall Street, more generally in the financial system in the United States, how to also make room for long-term cooperation with all the stakeholders. When I think of cooperation, I mean strictly mutually voluntary. Right? I'm not at all talking about regulation. I really don't have much to say about that. The challenge for finance, I think, is how to have, in a very competitive environment, and being finance is more conducive, I think, to competition, how to also make room for cooperation. One of my main themes is that cooperation and competition are very different mechanisms. And then finally, I'm going to argue, because competition is so different than cooperation, that finance needs faith. Cooperation, to some extent, requires a certain surrender to the common good, and faith emboldens us to surrender. This is the print called The Wave. It's probably the most famous Japanese print. There's 3 elements in this print that I want to point out. First, most obviously, is you got a huge wave, very stormy waters. For me, that's an analogy of the very competitive environment of business, and certainly the very competitive environment of Wall Street or finance more generally. And then you see those 3 mailboats. That's my analogy for a corporation. A group of ships sailing towards a common destination. That's my analogy for a business corporation. So the wave, the water, is like the market, if you like, competition, and then the fleet of ships is my analogy for cooperation. But if the waves are that high, and you need to coordinate among the ships, how do you know where you're going? Right? Where does our compass come from? Here I want to emphasize that if the waves are that high, and think of also all the currents that we have in our culture, we need something outside of ourselves, right, to give us direction. We need a compass that is not us. And that compass, of course, in the picture is Mount Fuji. For us Catholics, it's our church, it's our Savior Jesus Christ, it's the Catholic social teachings, and the example of the saints. So let me now go through each of those elements in a different order to emphasize the difference between competition and cooperation. First, Mount Fuji, our compass. The 3 universal principles of Catholic social teaching. This is like also Catholic social teaching with a small c, right? Universal human principles. I think these are the main guiding principles, I think, when I think about business in light of Catholic social thought. The first is human dignity, the intrinsic dignity of the human person, that business needs to contribute to human flourishing of every single person affected by or involved with business. This is also about seeing. Are we able to see the extent to which everyone involved with business is flourishing, and that everyone who is affected by or involved with business matters? The second pillar is solidarity. Are we judging the priorities of those with the greatest needs as our highest priority? Are we willing to see and then judge that those, again, with the greatest needs have the highest priority? And the third is what the church calls subsidiarity, which comes from the Latin word subsidium, which means help. Based on human freedom, we are asked to help each other, but also not interfere with each other's freedom. How do we know the difference between whether or not we're helping or we're interfering with someone's freedom? Well, you have to get to know the person. So subsidiarity is a social organization where you actually get to know the people that are affected by your decisions. It's also a certain type of servant leadership. It's about the person developing towards the best version of oneself in an environment where there's some shared understanding of that, where there's solidarity, where people are willing to help but not interfere with each other's development towards the best version of oneself. That then leads me to I also call these the 3 C's. Right? So the purpose of contributing to human flourishing, the priority of cooperating in solidarity, and the practice of competing, yes, externally in the marketplace, but more importantly, competing internally in subsidiarity towards the best version of oneself and the best version of everyone that you work with. Then back to the picture. And let's now go to the second element, the wave. The wave is threatening. The wave doesn't care where you want to go. The wave really doesn't care about you or me. So the wave is threatening, but it's also very adventurous. The wave also points us, I think, to the need for help. But in an environment like that, we need help. We also need to get anything enduring, anything lasting in that environment. We need to work together. Right? We need this solidarity, we need this teamwork, cooperation, interdependence. Business, finance, and waves like this are also good for our disciplining. In order to make it in an environment like that, in order to make it in finance, to make it in business, you're in a very disciplined environment that helps us to self-discipline and grow towards the best version of oneself. Back to the picture, and then finally to the 3 boats sailing together towards a shared destination, a shared good, a common good. Here, the main challenge for the 3 boats is, do they actually see where they're going together? Do we see the common good in business? Do we recognize there's a shared purpose? Secondarily, are we committed to cooperating with others? Right? Are we committed to solidarity in business? I think of solidarity as the willingness to share priorities. Where the needs the greatest, are we willing to share our priorities? Why would you make someone else's priorities your own priority? It's necessary for business, but why would you do it? Unless you recognize there's a shared purpose. And then you need to do business together, so you need to share a practice, right? And that means you grow in virtue through in subsidiarity, which again is in this social organization where you need some shared understanding of what human flourishing looks like. You need to be willing to grow in virtue, but generally you do that by helping others. Right? It's often through the help of others that you grow in virtue yourself. And I call these then also the 3 shared P's of business. The emphasis also on shared. The analogy here is really from C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity. It was actually in this city that I first read Mere Christianity and started reading almost everything that C.S. Lewis wrote. I grew up Catholic in the Netherlands, but quite a confused one, and more confusing you can probably imagine. And I first met people my age in New York City, right, who were practicing their faith and could explain their faith to me. And then my brother had done a similar reversion as I did, and he gave me this book to read, and I read it a couple of times. It was still one of my favorite books. And this analogy of the 3 ships actually is from Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis uses this fleet of ships to explain why any morality is always inherently social. There is no such thing, for example, as just a purely personal sin, right? It will always affect your relationship with God and then your relationship with others. I'm using the analogy, similarly emphasizing the shared nature of business. C.S. Lewis says there's 3 requirements for this voyage of this fleet of ships sailing towards a common destination to be a success. First, and you see repetition, right? I'm making the same point over and over again. First, the ships need to see the common good. They need to recognize their shared destination. Right? They need to see that there is a shared purpose. Second, they need to be helping each other as one team. They need to be willing to share priorities, make someone else's priorities their own priority. Otherwise, they will not get there as a fleet. And third, in practice, each ship needs to be seaworthy and disciplined. Right? That's about virtue, that's about our growing towards the best version of oneself, often through helping others to do the same, right, in shared practice. Then what is this common good? What is the shared purpose of business? I think of 3, and these are very interrelated or interdependent. Right? I summarize them as good work, good working, and good workers. Or back to the 3 C's or the 3 P's. You get sick of all those triads if you listen to me too long. But the good work is the goods and services that business provides that satisfy genuine needs of people, right? To contribute to human flourishing as the shared purpose. Good working is the good cooperative relationships of everyone involved, all the different stakeholders working together, which, being human persons, are intrinsically meaningful. Right? The willingness to share priorities in cooperative relationships. And then third, good workers, that we become closer to the best version of ourselves. We grow in virtue and skill by competing towards the best version of ourselves internally, and also externally in the marketplace. I think today is the feast day of Pope St. John Paul II. And I have a long quote here where Pope St. John Paul II lays out, I think, this idea of these 3 shared purposes, those 3 common goods of good work, good working, and good workers, in one of his social encyclicals, Solicitudo Rei Socialis. Pope St. John Paul II says, ownership, or business, is good and legitimate if it serves useful work. Provides for the needs of his family, his community, his nation, and ultimately all humanity. Right? What I call good work. Then good working, where ownership collaborates in the work of its fellow employees, as well as in the work of suppliers and in the customer's use of goods, in a progressively expanding chain of solidarity. And then third, good workers, man fulfills himself by using his intelligence and freedom. Man becomes more, right, through working in business. Well, if this is a vision of business, then what about finance? What about Wall Street? What about financial institutions? The world of finance, I think, is much more a world of competition. Very quickly, the 3 functions of finance. The first function of finance is aggregating information, giving information about where economic value is created. Financial markets are also very much markets of information. And finance is about connecting savers with lenders, connecting companies, right, with investors. Where often through risk sharing, right, all sides benefit, right, in mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial connections. And third, markets are about allocation, right, the efficient allocation of resources, right, in the market. That's the competitive process. Here are 3 key elements of the competitive process. The first is competition works primarily through a process of what I call adversarial bargaining. Not adversarial in a moral sense. Right? This has nothing to do with how you feel about the other person. It's adversarial in the sense that when I sell you something in a simple transaction, like I sell you a cup of coffee, then the more you pay me, the better it is for me, the worse for you, right, in that simple transaction. So you're bargaining in markets in an adversarial sense because, again, the more you pay, the better it is for me, the worse for you. In markets generally, it's also the case that in a very competitive market, my effectiveness doesn't depend on your effectiveness. I may actually be even more effective if others in the market are less effective. There is no coordination that is necessary, and generally there's not really a hierarchy outside of the institution of the market. So the prices, right, serve as the invisible hand. And in the market, well, if I don't give you what you want, that's great, you go to the next person. Right? In an efficient, competitive market, it's going to be very easy for you, if I don't give you what you want, right, to go to the next person who gives you a very close substitute of whatever it is that I would give you. So markets come with great benefits of information, connection, allocation. Right? They provide great incentives. They work through adversarial bargaining, through independent transactions where without a hierarchy or coordination, where prices serve as the invisible hand, and markets work best where there's close substitutes. Let's compare that with the process of cooperation. Right? Think of the fleet of ships. The key process in cooperation needs to start with this recognition of this shared purpose, this vision of where the company is going. Right? What are we contributing to human flourishing? Teamwork. Teamwork is not about adversarial bargaining. If you're working together with your team members, what you need is what Bo Benedict calls the logic of gift, the logic of gratuitousness, reciprocity. What you give to your team members may be very different than what each individual team member gives back to you. That requires an ex-ante commitment to share priorities within the team. It's like if you go into one of those boats. Once you get into one of those boats, guess what? You're going to be responsible for everybody else in all the other boats. That's what it means to get into one of those boats. Right? That's why there are 3 boats that go together. If something happens to one of the boats, the other 2 boats, they are responsible. So solidarity is about recognizing our ex-ante responsibility to solidarity, where what we owe each other is not, right, it's not just up to us. And it needs to be ex-ante, right? There needs to be something unconditional there, right? And it's again related to this sense of gratuitousness, for true cooperation to work in solidarity. And cooperation, more generally teamwork, is about complementarities rather than substitutes. There's interdependence in shared practice. That's what makes the teams work. So therefore, the process of competition and the process of cooperation are very different. We need both of them. But they need to be rightly ordered. So again, going back to Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI's writing, he distinguishes between what he calls the logic of exchange, that's the logic of markets. I think of that as the logic of competition, versus the logic of gratuitousness, the logic of gift, the logic of cooperation. The challenge of finance and the challenge of business more generally is how can we do really all 3? How can we cooperate through cooperation and then finally compete in all the different markets? Right? Compete in the financial market, compete in the labor market, compete in the product market. How can we do all 3? Where the challenge of finance is most particular, I think, because financial markets themselves are so inherently competitive. This is also, I think, very related to a significant statement made recently by the Business Roundtable. Right? So they had a new statement on corporate purpose. Let me also read this statement. They say, Americans deserve an economy that allows each person to succeed through hard work and creativity and to lead a life of meaning and dignity. We believe the free market system is the best means of generating good jobs, a strong and sustainable economy, innovation, a healthy environment, and economic opportunity for all. While each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purpose, we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders. The main point of the new statement of corporate purpose is to reorient from a more pure shareholder perspective to a stakeholder perspective. to reorient, I think, towards cooperation more. And that, I believe, requires commitment. Any type of cooperation, any type of teamwork requires the individual members of the team to be committed, right, to the team. Otherwise, right, there will not be true cooperation. So teamwork with interdependence and complementarity requires that each member of the team is committed to this longer-term cooperation. That depends on trust. And that trust is credibly only if people are committed. And that is, I think, where the central challenge of finance comes in. How can finance commit? The challenge of finance, in one word, I think, is exit. Right? Think about all the stakeholders that need to cooperate together towards the long-term strategy of the firm. Then think about, among all of these stakeholders, which of those has the easiest exit? Which of those, among all the stakeholders, is least committed to long-term cooperation? If you think about the fleet of ships, which of the stakeholders has the easiest way out when the storm gets really hard? Well, my answer is large, diversified shareholders, right? Generally finance. Finance generally has the best information. Finance generally has the most power in the sense that they can affect other people's circumstances without necessarily those others not being able to reciprocate. And finance generally has the most substitutes. Okay? So in order for finance then to both compete and cooperate with all the stakeholders towards long-term value creation, right? Finance needs commitment devices. Finance needs to commit. Here are some examples from my own work, and I published about this in finance journals and some law reviews. Here's a simple commitment device that I think can help large financial institutions to commit. And that's a staggered board. It's standard outside the United States. It has become less and less common in the United States. Right, the staggered board is where directors serve in the US 3-year overlapping terms. And that means that shareholders cannot replace all the directors all at once in the next annual meeting. You need to have at least 2 elections. Right? The first meeting, you can only replace 1/3 of directors. You have to wait until the second meeting to replace 2/3. Right? So a staggered board is an ex ante commitment by the shareholders to not be completely disruptive in the short term. In 2 elections, right, you can still change control of the board, but you cannot do so in the next annual election. And a commitment like that, we've argued in our academic work, can help the other stakeholders, right, to themselves be more committed to long-term cooperation with the firm. This is especially important for firms that have a lot of intangible assets, a lot of incomplete contracts, a lot of information uncertainty, a lot of complexity, and a lot of long-term investments in both technology but also capital investments. Another example of a way for shareholders to commit is to incorporate in a state with a stakeholder statute. Delaware does not have one. Most other US states have one, although about 80% of market cap in the United States is for firms incorporated in Delaware. Right? So Delaware is by far the most important corporate environment. And Delaware does not have a stakeholder statute. It's also called a director duties statute. A stakeholder statute allows the directors to explicitly think about the consequences in the long term for the stakeholders when you make an important financial decision. Again, it's a commitment. It doesn't force the board to do so, but it explicitly allows it. Another example is a supermajority voting requirement to, for example, before you agree to a takeover, a merger, or change the rules of the game, right? Change the corporate charter and bylaws. By making it hard to change, right, you kind of commit to the stakeholders that the current way of doing business, right, is what you are committed to. None of these 3 things mean that you cannot change everything. It just will take a bit longer, and it requires longer conversation with more people. Okay? And that, I think, is the paradox of commitment, is you partly limit your own power to better serve others. I think it's a moral necessity, because oftentimes those with the strongest exit rights also are the ones with the strongest information, power, and control. It's also a social necessity, especially in our world with increasing inequality. And surprisingly, in our academic work, we find that it is an economic necessity. Our surprising result is that firms where the shareholders are more willing to commit to work with the stakeholders through a staggered board, through incorporating in a state with a stakeholder statute, through having supermajority requirements to change charter and bylaws, and I can give you several other examples, that actually helps the shareholders. A lot of other finance academics, they're very skeptical of our beliefs, so I invite you to read my papers if you're interested. But our results suggest that it's actually in the long-term interest of the shareholders themselves. Perhaps not the short-term, but the long-term interest of the shareholders themselves. You also see the markets changing. Most IPO firms controlled by venture capital, they have a staggered board. The high technology firms with most long-term technologies, they often have dual-class stock, which is kind of an extreme version, right, of a commitment device. But it's difficult, I think, if you are a person with a very strong exit, if you are the person with the superior information, power, and control, to commit, right, to limit your own power. In that sense, commitment is a sort of surrender. It's a surrender, right, to commitment to work with others. And I think for that, business and finance in particular needs faith. It needs faith to see this common good in business, right, the shared purpose in business, through cooperation in a competitive environment. You need faith that your willingness to share priorities, to cooperate in solidarity. And finally, we need faith to commit to subsidiarity, to a shared practice of growing towards the best version of oneself through helping others do the same way, to compete internally as well as externally. Let me close with a long quote from my favorite encyclical, and in my mind, the most theological of the social encyclicals, which is a long quote by Pope Benedict XVI, where my talk is kind of trying to do what Pope Benedict was calling for here. He says, we try to demonstrate not only that traditional principles of social ethics, like transparency, honesty, and responsibility, cannot be ignored or attenuated, but also that in commercial relationships, the principle of gratuitousness and the logic of gift as an expression of fraternity can and must find their place within normal economic activity. This is a human demand at the present time, but it is also demanded by economic logic. It is a demand both of charity and of truth, according to Pope Benedict XVI. Thank you.